Marshall Huffman's polished Oxford shoes clicked against the marble floors of Pinnacle Acquisition's executive floor. At 48, he cut an imposing figure, 6'2", broad-shouldered, with steel-gray eyes that could dissect a balance sheet as easily as they could read a room. His tailored charcoal suit spoke of success, but it was his presence that commanded respect. "Morning, Mr. Huffman," his assistant, Sarah, called out as he passed her desk. "The Q3 merger projections are on your desk, and Mr. Lancaster wants to see you at 11. Marshall nodded, his mind already processing the day ahead. "Thanks, Sarah. Push the Transglobal meeting to 2. I want to review those projections first." Inside his corner office, Marshall settled into his leather chair, taking in the Manhattan skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. 23 years at Pinnacle had earned him this view, along with the CFO position that made him Robert Lancaster's right hand. The thought of his CEO brought a slight frown to his otherwise composed features. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife, Isabella. "Charity committee meeting with Robert today. Don't wait up for dinner." Marshall's thumb hovered over the message. These meetings had become more frequent lately. He dismissed the thought. Isabella had been managing their social calendar for 15 years, and her networking had only helped their family's position. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Alexandra, his eldest daughter, strode in with the confidence of someone who already saw herself in his chair. At 22, fresh from Harvard Business School, she carried herself with the polished grace of old money. Money Marshall had worked decades to provide. "Dad," she said, perching on the edge of his desk rather than taking a seat. "Robert mentioned there might be an opening in strategic planning. I thought I'd stop by and remind you that my Harvard network could be valuable there." Marshall studied his daughter's face. She had Isabella's features, the same honey blonde hair and green eyes. But lately, he'd noticed something else in her expression, something calculated. "Alexandra, we've discussed this entry-level position. Please," she cut him off with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "We both know I'm not entry-level material. Robert agrees with me." The casual use of his CEO's first name didn't escape Marshall's notice. He maintained his neutral expression, years of high-stakes negotiations serving him well. "We'll discuss this at home," he said firmly. "I have the Transglobal merger to focus on." Alexandra's smile tightened. "Of course, Dad. Mother's hosting dinner next week with the Lancaster family. Maybe we can discuss it then." After she left, Marshall pulled up the Transglobal merger documents. The deal would be his largest yet, a $4.2 billion acquisition that would solidify Pinnacle's position in the market. His phone buzzed again with a group text from his twins, Thomas and Timothy. "Dad, need to discuss summer internship. Robert mentioned positions opening up." Marshall's jaw tightened. When had his CEO become so involved with his children's careers? The twins were only 19, sophomores at Yale. Yet they spoke of Robert with a familiarity that seemed presumptuous for their age. A video call notification popped up on his screen. Victoria, his 17-year-old daughter from her boarding school. "Dad," her face filled the screen, the prestigious Westfield Academy's limestone buildings visible behind her. "The school's endowment committee is reviewing donations. Mr. Lancaster said you'd handle it." "Victoria, why are you talking to Robert about school donations?" She rolled her eyes in a way that reminded him too much of Isabella. "Mom said to ask him first. You're always so busy with work stuff." "I am busy," Marshall replied, "ensuring your tuition is paid and your trust fund grows. Speaking of which, how's your brother?" "Andrew's fine. He's probably in lacrosse practice." "Oh, Mother said to remind you about next Thursday's dinner." After ending the call, Marshall leaned back in his chair, his mind working with the precision that had made him one of Wall Street's most respected CFOs. Something felt off, like when the numbers in a merger proposal didn't quite add up. The rest of his day passed in a blur of meetings and conference calls. The Transglobal merger consumed most of his attention. The deal had to be perfect. By evening, most of Pinnacle's employees had left, leaving the office floors in silence. Sarah stopped by his office one last time. "Mr. Huffman, will you be needing anything else?" Mr. Lancaster and Mrs. Huffman left about an hour ago. "Another charity meeting, I believe." Marshall noted the slight hesitation in Sarah's voice. "No, thank you, Sarah. Have a good evening." He worked for another hour, reviewing performance reports and bonus structures. His own bonuses had been exceptionally generous over the years, Robert's way of recognizing his contribution to Pinnacle's growth. Those bonuses had funded their mansion in Greenwich, the children's education, Isabella's social endeavors. At 9:30, Marshall decided to head home early. The house would likely be empty. Isabella's charity meetings often ran late, but he had financial models to review in his home office. The drive to Greenwich was quiet, his Mercedes cutting through the cool autumn night. Their estate's gates opened automatically, security cameras tracking his car's progress up the winding driveway. The house stood impressively against the dark sky. 6 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a testament to his success. He was about to enter through the front door when he noticed lights in the family room. Voices drifted through the partially open French doors. Isabella's laugh, the one she reserved for social occasions, made him pause. "Your real father is Robert Lancaster," Isabella's voice carried clearly through the gap. Marshall's hand froze on the door handle. Inside, he could see his family gathered in the warm light of their family room. Isabella stood by the fireplace, looking elegant in an expensive dress he didn't recognize. Their children sat around her, expressions ranging from amusement to conspiracy. "He's been funding everything through your dad's bonuses," Isabella continued, swirling wine in a crystal glass. "Once the transglobal merger closes next month, we'll take control of everything." Marshall's too focused on spreadsheets to notice he's just been our frontman. The words hit Marshall like physical blows, but decades of corporate negotiations had taught him to control his reactions. He remained perfectly still, gathering intelligence like he would in a hostile takeover. Alexandra's laugh cut through the room. "Dad's such a fool. He actually thinks he earned those bonuses. Robert showed me the real books. Every penny was planned. Your father," Isabella emphasized with mock sweetness, "has been useful. His financial expertise made everything look legitimate. The board trusts him completely. But why keep him around so long?" Thomas or Timothy asked. Marshall couldn't see which twin had spoken. "Because, darling," Isabella's voice dripped with condescension, "Marshall's reputation is impeccable. No one questions his financial decisions. Robert needed that credibility." "And the merger?" Victoria's voice now, eager to be part of the adult conversation. "It will be our masterpiece. Once it closes, the transfer of assets will be untraceable. Marshall's signature on everything makes it perfectly legal." "What about the other shareholders?" Andrew asked, surprising Marshall with his grasp of corporate matters. Robert's laugh was cold. "They'll be too busy dealing with the merger's fallout to notice where the money went. By the time anyone realizes what happened, we'll be settled somewhere without extradition treaties." "And Marshall?" Isabella asked, an edge to her voice that Marshall had never heard before. "We'll take the fall," Robert replied casually. "His signatures are on everything. The board will assume he orchestrated the whole thing." Quite poetic. "Really? The trusted CFO betraying everyone. Alexandra's Harvard connections will help smooth the transition," Isabella added proudly. "No one will question her taking over his position afterward. We've planned everything perfectly." Marshall watched his oldest daughter beam at the praise. "The Harvard Alumni Association already thinks I'm following in Dad's footsteps. They have no idea whose footsteps I'm really following." The twins high-fived each other. "Yale's business school won't know what hit them." One of them said, "Robert's donations guarantee our spots." "When do we tell them?" Victoria asked, sounding younger than her 17 years. "Tell him." Isabella laughed. "Oh, darling, Marshall won't need to be told anything. Once the merger closes, everything will happen so fast, he won't know what hit him. Robert has arranged for certain irregularities to be discovered. Marshall's reputation will be destroyed so thoroughly." No one will believe a word he says. The timing has to be perfect. Robert added, the transglobal merger is complex enough that any financial discrepancies will be buried in the details. Marshall's own thoroughness works against him. He's documented everything so meticulously that his signature on the fraudulent documents will be unquestionable. Marshall had heard enough. With the same silent precision he used in corporate takeovers, he withdrew from the door. His mind was already cataloging information, forming strategies, identifying weaknesses in their plan. He made his way to his home office, careful not to make a sound. The room was his sanctuary, a place where he had structured countless deals, orchestrated mergers that had made Pinnacle a powerhouse. Now it would serve a different purpose. Logging into his secure terminal, Marshall began pulling up records. Years of transaction histories, bonus payments, offshore transfers. Everything he had overseen as CFO. But now he looked at them with new eyes, seeing the pattern he had missed. Each major merger had corresponded with substantial bonuses to his accounts. Those bonuses had then been quietly transferred to shell companies, companies he now recognized as being controlled by Isabella. Robert had used Marshall's legitimate merger work as cover for massive fraud, while secretly transferring company assets through Marshall's bonuses into accounts his wife controlled. The scheme was brilliant in its simplicity. Marshall's reputation for financial integrity had made him the perfect unwitting accomplice. Every successful deal he closed for Pinnacle had been used to hide their fraudulent transfers. His own legitimate earnings had masked the illegal flow of funds. More disturbing were the documents he found regarding Alexandra, his daughter's Harvard admission, her internships, her entire career path. All had been orchestrated by Robert and Isabella. They had been grooming her to take over Marshall's position after the merger, using her Harvard connections to legitimize the transition. The transglobal merger would be their masterstroke. Marshall could see it clearly now. The complex transaction would provide cover for the largest asset transfer yet. By the time anyone unraveled the details, Robert and Isabella would be gone, along with billions in company assets. Marshall would be left to face federal investigators, his signature on countless fraudulent documents. Hours passed as Marshall dug deeper, documenting everything. His financial expertise, the very skill Robert and Isabella had exploited, now served to uncover their decade-long conspiracy. Every transaction, every transfer, every false document, Marshall captured it all. He was breaking when he finally leaned back in his chair. In the growing light, he could hear movement in the house, his family starting their day, unaware that their carefully constructed plan was about to implode. Marshall allowed himself a small, cold smile. They had underestimated him badly. They saw what they wanted to see, the predictable CFO, too focused on spreadsheets to notice their betrayal. They forgot that those same spreadsheets had helped him orchestrate some of the most complex corporate takeovers in recent history. A knock at his office door. "Dad." Alexandra's voice. "You're home early. Mother said you had a late meeting." "Just reviewing some merger documents." Marshall replied evenly. "How's the Harvard Alumni Association these days?" "Oh, you know, networking, making connections." "Robert think." "I'm sure he does." Marshall cut her off smoothly. "Tell your mother I'll be working from home today. The transglobal merger needs my full attention." After Alexandra left, Marshall began composing emails. The board would need to be informed. Evidence would need to be distributed. Assets would need to be secured. But first, he had some calls to make to certain foreign banks. Let Robert and Isabella think they had orchestrated the perfect plan. Marshall hadn't become Pinnacle's CFO by being predictable. By the time they realized their mistake, it would be far too late. The morning sun cast long shadows across his desk as Marshall began implementing his counterattack. In the house beyond his office, his family went about their morning routines, confident in their secrets. Marshall allowed himself another small smile. They had taught him an invaluable lesson about family loyalty. He intended to show them exactly how well he had learned it. Marshall's fingers moved across his keyboard with surgical precision. The first light crept through his home office windows, but he hadn't slept. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not when every minute counted. His computer screens displayed a complex web of financial transactions, 10 years of performance bonuses stretched across multiple spreadsheets, each one a perfectly orchestrated lie. Robert Lancaster's signature appeared consistently alongside his own, a detail that brought a cold smile to Marshall's face. "Amateur," he muttered, documenting another fraudulent transfer. Robert had been clever, but he'd made a crucial mistake. He'd assumed Marshall's financial expertise was limited to legitimate transactions. Sarah, his assistant, answered on the first ring despite the early hour. "Mr. Huffman." "Sarah, I need complete access to all merger documents from the past decade. Every signature, every amendment, every appendix." "And Sarah, use the secure server. No one else needs to know." "Of course, Mr. Huffman. Should I inform Mr. Lancaster?" "No need. He'll find out soon enough." Marshall disconnected the call and pulled up the transglobal merger documents. The deal's complexity had been deliberate. Robert and Isabella had planned to use it as cover for their final heist. But complexity cut both ways. A notification popped up. "Access granted to the secure server." Marshall's hands flew across the keyboard, his mind dissecting years of financial manipulation. Robert's pattern emerged clearly now. Artificially inflated company valuations, funds funneled through Marshall's bonuses, assets quietly transferred to shell companies owned by Isabella. "Sloppy," Marshall commented, noting how Robert had used the same offshore banks repeatedly. "Predictable." He accessed Pinnacle's main financial system using his CFO credentials. Robert had never understood the full extent of Marshall's system access. Another fatal mistake. Within hours, Marshall had traced every fraudulent transaction, documented every illegal transfer, mapped every shell company connection. His phone buzzed. "Isabella. Darling, are you coming to breakfast? The children are asking for you." Marshall's voice remained perfectly pleasant. "Still working on the transglobal merger. Don't wait for me." Robert called. "He wants to discuss some last-minute details." "I'm sure he does." After hanging up, Marshall accessed a secure line to contact James Chin, his personal attorney, one whose existence neither Robert nor Isabella knew about. "James, initiate Protocol 7. "Yes, all of it." "And James, make it ironclad." The next hours passed in a blur of precise financial maneuvers. Marshall methodically transferred all legitimate company assets into secure holding companies, his actions masked by the merger's normal activities. Robert's planned poison pills were identified and neutralized one by one. A knock at his office door. "Dad." Alexandra's voice. "Mother says you've been in here all night. The merger requires attention." "Alexandra. Or perhaps Robert hasn't explained that part to you." A pause. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course not. Tell your mother I'll be busy all day. The transglobal deal needs my personal touch." After Alexandra's footsteps faded, Marshall accessed another secure line. "Mr. Zhao." "Yes, about those offshore accounts." "Execute option B. All of them." By mid-morning, Marshall had compiled an exhaustive record of Robert and Isabella's decade-long conspiracy. Every fraudulent transaction, every manipulated valuation, every illicit transfer, all documented with meticulous precision. His findings revealed the true scope of Robert's ambition. The transglobal merger wasn't just another deal. It was meant to be a corporate extinction event. Sarah's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Huffman, Mr. Lancaster is asking about the merger documents. Tell him they'll be ready by end of day." "And Sarah, thank you for your loyalty over the years." Marshall turned to the wall safe, hidden behind an original Rothko. A gift from Robert, ironically. Inside lay USB drives containing evidence of tax fraud, embezzlement, and securities violations. Each drive was perfectly organized, ready for distribution to board members. His phone buzzed again with a group chat from Thomas and Timothy. "Dad, Robert mentioned board meeting tomorrow. Still good for Yale summer internships." Marshall's reply was brief. Focus on your studies. Tomorrow will be educational. A separate message from Victoria. Dad, Mother says you're being difficult about the merger. Robert think. He cut off the message. His youngest children, Victoria and Andrew, would learn soon enough about their mother's true nature. By afternoon, Marshall had discovered something even more damning. Robert hadn't just been documenting the fraud. He'd been keeping detailed records of Isabella's involvement, obviously planning to use it as leverage. The records included Isabella's parallel schemes at their children's private schools, where she'd been embezzling from the charity foundation she managed. Protecting himself while betraying her, Marshall noted. How appropriate. He accessed another secure line. Agent Phillips. Yes, it's time. Everything will be on your desk by morning. And the offshore accounts. Yes, all of them. You'll find Mrs. Huffman's fingerprints particularly interesting. The sun was setting when Marshall finished his final preparations. His counterattack was orchestrated with the same precision applied to his most successful mergers. Every detail was accounted for, every contingency planned for. Sarah's voice came through one last time. Mr. Huffman, the board members are confirmed for tomorrow's emergency meeting. Thank you, Sarah. One last thing. Please ensure those USB drives are placed at their seats before the meeting. Marshall stood at his office window, watching the estate's security cameras on his tablet. Isabella's car was pulling up. Another charity meeting with Robert had run late. His children's vehicles were all accounted for. Everyone home for what they thought would be a normal family dinner. His phone buzzed with a message from Robert. Marshall, need to discuss some concerning irregularities in the merger documents. Urgent meeting tomorrow, 8 a.m. Marshall allowed himself a small smile as he typed his reply. Of course, Robert. I found some irregularities myself. Tomorrow will be illuminating. He watched through the security feed as Isabella entered the house. Her designer handbag, a gift from Robert, swinging carelessly. Alexandra's voice drifted up from downstairs, discussing Harvard Alumni Association contacts. The twins were arguing about Yale's business school requirements, while Victoria and Andrew debated which summer house they'd use after the merger. Marshall turned back to his computers, implementing the final phases of his plan. By morning, Robert and Isabella's carefully constructed world would collapse. The evidence was irrefutable. The documentation perfect. The trap inescapable. His phone buzzed one last time. Isabella again. Darling, aren't you joining us for dinner? The children want to discuss their future plans. Marshall's reply was succinct. Still working. The future requires careful planning. He turned back to his work, his movements precise and purposeful. They had taught him valuable lessons about family, loyalty, and betrayal. Tomorrow, he would demonstrate exactly how well he had learned them. The night deepened as Marshall executed the final stages of his counterattack. Each move was calculated, each action deliberate. Robert and Isabella had spent a decade building their fraudulent empire. Marshall would dismantle it in a single day. Sarah's final message of the night appeared. Everything is in place. Mr. Huffman, the board members will receive their notifications at dawn. Thank you, Sarah. Tomorrow will be a day of revelations. In the house below, his family continued their evening, unaware that their carefully constructed facade was about to shatter. Marshall allowed himself another small, cold smile. They had mistaken his precision for predictability, his attention to detail for blindness, his loyalty for weakness. Tomorrow, they would understand their error. The night grew later, but Marshall's focus never wavered. His screens displayed the culmination of his work, a comprehensive map of Robert and Isabella's criminal enterprise, ready to be exposed to the light of day. Every transaction traced, every fraud documented, every betrayal cataloged. His phone's final notification of the night was from Robert Lancaster's private number. Marshall, Isabella mentioned you've been working late. Any concerns about tomorrow's board meeting? Marshall's response was carefully measured. No concerns, Robert. Just ensuring everything is properly documented. See you at 8. He turned back to his screens, implementing the last phases of his plan. They had spent years underestimating him, seeing only what they wanted to see. Tomorrow, they would learn the cost of that mistake. Robert Lancaster strode through Pinnacle's executive terminal, his private jet waiting on the tarmac. Behind him, Bloomberg terminals flashed red as news of the fraud allegations decimated Pinnacle's stock price. The transglobal merger was imploding spectacularly, exactly as Marshall had planned. Mr. Lancaster, his pilot, James Wilson, greeted him at the terminal. "Weather looks clear to the Caymans." Robert barely acknowledged him, too busy barking orders into his phone. "Move everything. I don't care about the fees. Empty all the accounts now." "Problems, sir?" Wilson asked, taking Robert's briefcase. "Just fly the plane, Wilson." What Robert didn't know was that Wilson had been Marshall's plant for years, placed specifically for this moment. As they took off, Wilson entered coordinates not for the Caymans, but for a private airstrip where FBI agents waited. Meanwhile, at the Greenwich estate, Isabella frantically dialed numbers on her phone. "What do you mean the accounts are empty?" She screamed at her Swiss banker. "Check again. Madam Huffman, the accounts were cleared 3 days ago. Mr. Lancaster's orders." Isabella's perfectly manicured hand trembled as she opened her laptop, accessing the offshore accounts one by one. Each login revealed the same truth. Robert had betrayed her. Her phone buzzed with a text from Robert. "Sorry, darling. Business is business." On her screen, a new email appeared from Marshall's attorney. The subject line: Prenuptial Agreement, Section 7.4, in downtown Manhattan. Alexandra burst into tears as the Harvard Alumni Association rescinded her job offer. Due to emerging allegations of academic fraud, the twins weren't faring better. Yale's Dean of Admissions had some pointed questions about their acceptance and certain donations made by Robert Lancaster. Victoria and Andrew huddled in their respective boarding school dormitories, watching their family's disgrace unfold on national news. Marshall observed it all from a secure location, his laptop displaying multiple feeds. Robert's plane changing course, Isabella's failed bank logins, the federal agents swarming their estate. "Mr. Huffman," Agent Phillips reported via secure line. "Mr. Lancaster's plane is being diverted now. Would you like to watch the arrest?" "No need," Marshall replied. "Send me the paperwork when it's done." 3 months later, Marshall sat in his new office, the CEO's suite at Pinnacle Acquisitions. The board's vote had been unanimous. After all, he had saved the company from complete destruction. Robert Lancaster's federal indictment made for interesting reading: securities fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy. But it was Isabella's charges that drew Marshall's attention. Her charity foundation schemes had been more extensive than anyone suspected. "Mr. Huffman," his new assistant announced, "the FBI has more questions about Mrs. Huffman's activities at the children's schools. Send them everything." Marshall replied, "Every donation, every transaction. The evidence is damning." Isabella had been running parallel embezzlement schemes through various school charity foundations, using her position on their boards to siphon millions. In the federal detention center, Robert Lancaster was learning the cost of betrayal. His fellow inmates didn't take kindly to someone who had planned to leave thousands jobless. Isabella's arrest made headlines. Charity Queen's empire of fraud exposed. Her social circle evaporated overnight. The same people who had attended her lavish fundraisers now pretended they'd never known her. Alexandra faced her own reckoning at Harvard. The Academic Review Board had some uncomfortable questions about her admission and subsequent performance. The twins watched their Yale careers crumble as evidence of Robert's illegal donations emerge. Their trust funds, frozen by federal investigators, revealed a web of fraudulent transfers. Victoria and Andrew struggled with a different kind of loss. Their entire family narrative had been a lie. Marshall implemented sweeping changes at Pinnacle. New anti-fraud measures, transparent accounting practices, ethical oversight committees. The company's stock price responded positively to each reform. 1 year later, Marshall stood at a podium accepting the Corporate Ethics Leadership Award. Pinnacle's value had tripled under his leadership. The company had become a model of corporate transparency. Integrity, he told the audience, is not negotiable. His eyes swept over the crowd, noting the absent faces of his former family. Alexandra was fighting to keep her Harvard degree. The twins had been expelled from Yale. Victoria and Andrew were learning harsh lessons about trust and betrayal. Robert watched the ceremony on prison TV, his 30-year sentence stretching before him. Through his cell window, he could see the sign of his former car dealership, now Marshall's Corporate Ethics Foundation headquarters. Isabella, awaiting her own trial, discovered the final irony of her betrayal. The prenuptial agreement she had insisted on, meant to protect her assets, now prevented her from claiming any of Marshall's legitimate wealth. "Your Honor," her lawyer argued in court, "Mrs. Huffman's charitable work. You mean her systematic embezzlement from school foundations." The judge wasn't impressed. Marshall's foundation became a leader in exposing family-based corporate conspiracies. Its first case study, the Bomis Plan, became required reading at business schools. The story of how one family's greed nearly destroyed an empire, and how integrity ultimately triumphed, served as a warning to corporate America. Marshall's name became synonymous with ethical leadership, while Robert and Isabella became cautionary tales. In his CEO's office, Marshall reviewed the final numbers. Pinnacle had emerged stronger, more transparent, more valuable. His revenge hadn't just been complete, it had been profitable. "Mr. Huffman," his assistant called. "The prison warden is on line 1. Mr. Lancaster is requesting a meeting." Marshall's response was simple. No comment. He turned back to his work, the Manhattan skyline stretching behind him. They had taught him about family, loyalty, and betrayal. He had taught them about consequences. The Corporate Ethics Leadership Award sat on his desk, its inscription catching the light. To those who choose integrity over family loyalty when the two conflict, Marshall had made his choice. The empty chairs at his family table spoke louder than any revenge could have. Epilogue. The final ledger. 5 years later, Marshall Huffman stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office in the newly renamed Huffman Tower, formerly Pinnacle headquarters. At 53, his success had only amplified his commanding presence. The Wall Street Journal on his desk carried the headline, "Huffman Ethics Foundation Expands Global Reach. Corporate Watchdog Sets New Standards." His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Huffman, the prison warden is on line 3. Put him through." Marshall's voice remained as measured as ever. "Mr. Huffman, Robert Lancaster is requesting another meeting. He claims to have information about additional offshore accounts. Tell him what you've told him the last dozen times. All communications go through the Foundation's legal team." The warden cleared his throat. "He's not doing well, sir." The appeal denial hit him hard. "Neither are the thousands whose pensions he tried to steal." Marshall replied, "Anything else?" "No, sir. Thank you for your time." Marshall pulled up the Foundation's latest report on his tablet. Robert Lancaster's fall had become their most comprehensive case study. 5 years into his 30-year sentence, the former CEO had aged decades. His attempts to bargain his way to a reduced sentence had failed consistently, each appeal revealing new layers of his fraud. The maximum security wing of federal prison was a far cry from his former penthouse. The only view from his cell was the gleaming headquarters of the Huffman Ethics Foundation, formerly his prized luxury car dealership. The Foundation's illuminated sign served as a nightly reminder of his downfall. Sarah, Marshall's longtime assistant, and now the Foundation's CEO, entered with a stack of reports. The latest from the Isabella Lancaster case, Marshall noted the name change. Isabella had reverted to Lancaster after the divorce, a final act of desperation that backfired spectacularly. The prenuptial agreement she'd insisted on had worked exactly as intended, just not in her favor. "How is she enjoying house arrest?" Marshall asked, though he already knew the answer. "The ankle monitor doesn't match her designer wardrobe." Sarah replied with a slight smile. The latest appeal was denied. Her legal team tried to argue that the charity foundation embezzlement was Robert's idea, and the evidence showed otherwise. Your documentation was flawless, as usual. The judge particularly enjoyed the recordings of her bragging about fooling the school boards. Isabella's fall from grace had been absolute. After serving 3 years in federal prison for fraud and embezzlement, she'd been released to house arrest, not to her former mansion, but to a modest apartment her remaining family reluctantly provided. Her social circle had evaporated, her charity connections had become toxic, and her attempts to write a tell-all book had been blocked by the foundation's legal team. The children? Marshall inquired, though he kept meticulous tabs on all of them. Sarah pulled up another report. Alexandra completed her community service last month. The Harvard degree revocation stands. They found evidence of systematic cheating beyond even what we initially discovered. She's working as a junior analyst at a small firm in Milwaukee, under her mother's maiden name. The twins, Thomas and Timothy, had faced their own reckonings. Yale's expulsion had led to a series of increasingly desperate attempts to trade on their former connections. Their trust funds, revealed to be built entirely on fraudulent transfers, had been seized and redistributed to Pinnacle's Victim Compensation Fund. Thomas tried to contact the foundation again. Sarah continued, "He's offering to speak at our corporate ethics seminars. Timothy is still trying to day trade with what's left of their allowance." Victoria had chosen a different path. After the truth emerged about her family's crimes, she'd legally changed her name and enrolled in a public high school. Now in her second year of community college, she was the only one who'd made a clean break from her parents' influence. Andrew, the youngest at 20, was studying engineering at a state university under a merit scholarship, the only one of Marshall's children to earn his place legitimately. He occasionally sent progress reports through the foundation's legal team, maintaining professional but distant contact. "The latest numbers from Pinnacle?" Marshall asked, turning to the business empire he'd rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. Sarah projected the quarterly report onto the wall screen. Under Marshall's leadership, Pinnacle has become a model of corporate transparency and ethical governance. The stock price has quadrupled, the workforce has grown by 30%, and the company's ethical business practices have set new industry standards. "The SEC is using our compliance framework as a template," Sarah noted. 3 other Fortune 500 companies have adopted our transparency protocols. Marshall nodded, turning to another matter. The Lancaster family's last attempt to access the offshore accounts failed spectacularly. Your early warning to the Swiss authorities proved invaluable. Robert's hidden transfers to his personal accounts were tracked and seized. Isabella's attempts to claim ignorance of the accounts backfired when our documentation showed her signature on the original paperwork. The foundation's legal team systematically dismantled every attempt by Robert or Isabella to salvage any part of their stolen fortune. Each appeal, each legal challenge, each desperate plea had only served to strengthen the case against them. Marshall's phone buzzed with a news alert. Lancaster charity fraud. New evidence reveals deeper conspiracy. The article detailed how Isabella's embezzlement from school foundations had begun even before her marriage to Marshall, a fact she'd hidden from everyone, including Robert. "Your speech for next week's Ethics and Leadership Conference?" Sarah inquired. "Done. No mentions of names. As usual. The facts speak for themselves." The foundation had grown beyond even Marshall's initial vision. What started as a watchdog organization had evolved into a global authority on corporate ethics and family-based fraud prevention. Their case studies were taught at business schools worldwide, with the bonus plan remaining their most compelling example. A notification popped up on Marshall's screen. A message from Agent Phillips, now the FBI's Deputy Director of Financial Crimes. "Thought you'd want to know. Robert tried to broker another deal. Claims he can expose Isabella's earliest frauds in exchange for a transfer to minimum security. We declined." Marshall's reply was brief. As expected, the Foundation's investigation had already uncovered those frauds, along with evidence that Robert had known about them from the beginning. Their mutual betrayal had been documented in exquisite detail, each partner planning to abandon the other once the transglobal merger was complete. Sarah cleared her throat. "One more thing, sir. The Princeton Ethics Department wants to do a longitudinal study on the case. They're particularly interested in the children's rehabilitation outcomes. Forward them the public records." Nothing more. Marshall's position on his former family remained consistent. Professional distance maintained through legal channels. He neither helped nor hindered their attempts to rebuild their lives, letting the consequences of their choices play out naturally. The sun was setting over Manhattan as Marshall reviewed the Foundation's latest initiative, a global database tracking family-based corporate fraud patterns. The system would help identify warning signs and prevent future schemes, using the Lancaster case as its baseline. "Will you be attending Robert's next parole hearing?" Sarah asked, though she knew the answer. No need. The documentation speaks for itself. Robert's previous hearings had become increasingly desperate performances. His attempts to portray himself as a victim of circumstances had crumbled under the weight of evidence. The parole board had access to every document, every recording, every betrayal. Isabella's latest court-mandated psychiatric evaluation had revealed what Marshall had known all along. Her remorse was as fraudulent as her charity work. She'd spent her prison time networking with white-collar criminals, already planning her next schemes. "The Foundation's annual report is ready for review," Sarah noted. "The section on preventing inherited positions of trust is particularly relevant." The report detailed how family connections had been used to disguise financial fraud, using the Lancaster case as its primary example. Alexandra Sanders' grooming for Marshall's position, the twins' fraudulent Yale admissions, Victoria and Andrew's planned roles, all had been documented and analyzed. Marshall's phone buzzed again, a message from his corporate ethics professor at Harvard Business School. "Your case study has transformed our curriculum. Would you consider giving this year's commencement address?" He typed a brief acceptance. The irony wasn't lost on him. The institution that had unknowingly hosted part of Robert and Isabella's scheme would now hear from the man who exposed it. As night fell over Manhattan, Marshall stood at his office windows one last time. The city stretched before him, its lights reflecting off the Huffman Tower's glass facade. In a cell hundreds of miles away, Robert Lancaster would be watching the Foundation sign illuminate the darkness. In her modest apartment, Isabella would be planning another doomed appeal. Their children, scattered across the country, would be facing their own daily reminders of choices and consequences. Alexandra, in her entry-level position, the twins and their failed trading ventures. Victoria in her community college classes, Andrew in his engineering studies. Sarah appeared at his door. "Car's ready, sir. The Foundation's board meeting starts in 30 minutes. Marshall gathered his papers. The Foundation's latest initiative would help other companies identify and prevent family-based fraud schemes. The Lancaster case would continue teaching its lessons long after its principals had faced their final judgments. One last thing," Sarah added. Isabella's publisher reached out again about the book deal. "Same answer as always," Marshall replied. "Let the evidence tell the story." He stepped into the elevator, descending toward the Foundation's headquarters. The former luxury car dealership had been transformed into a center for corporate ethics research, its mission statement carved in marble. Integrity above all. In the end, Robert and Isabella had taught him valuable lessons about family, loyalty, and betrayal. Through the Foundation, he would ensure those lessons benefited generations of corporate leaders to come. Their story had become a cautionary tale, their names synonymous with fraud and betrayal. But the true legacy of the Lancaster affair wasn't in their downfall. It was in the systems and safeguards their scheme had inspired. Marshall's revenge hadn't just been complete. It had been transformative. The empire they tried to steal had become a fortress of corporate integrity, their betrayal fueling a global movement for ethical business practices. As his car pulled away from the tower, Marshall allowed himself a small smile. They had taught him about the price of trust. He had taught the world about the value of truth. The final ledger was balanced. The books were closed. The bonus plan had paid its last dividend.